Imagine discovering that your family history simply stops, not because nobody remembered it, not because nobody cared, but because the records were never meant to survive. For millions of Black Americans, that isn't a hypothetical question, it's reality. Some families can trace their history back hundreds of years through letters, church records, land deeds, and family archives. Generation after generation appears neatly preserved on paper. But for many descendants of enslaved people, the trail often ends abruptly. A name appears, then another, and then suddenly nothing. The record goes silent. Entire lives seem to disappear. Entire families vanish into history. For generations, historians believed many of those missing stories might never be recovered. The documents were gone. The witnesses were gone. The people who lived those lives had long since passed away. And yet, in the last few decades, scientists discovered something extraordinary. Another record survived, not in a courthouse, not in a government archive, not in an old family Bible, inside the human genome itself. And what researchers have begun uncovering from that hidden record is helping reconstruct chapters of history that many believed were lost forever. But before we get to what they found, we need to understand why so much history disappeared in the first place. Because this story doesn't begin in a laboratory, it begins centuries earlier, long before DNA testing existed, long before modern genetics, long before anyone imagined that biological evidence could help answer historical questions. It begins on the western coast of Africa. Before the Atlantic slave trade reached its full scale, West and West Central Africa contained some of the most genetically diverse populations on Earth. Hundreds of communities, hundreds of languages, distinct kingdoms, trade networks stretching across vast regions, families whose histories extended back countless generations. Contrary to how many people imagine the period, these societies were not blank spaces waiting to be discovered by outsiders. They were complex, organized, connected, and deeply rooted in their own histories. Every community carried traditions, every family carried memories, every generation inherited stories from those who came before. Then the Atlantic world changed everything. Over the course of several centuries, millions of Africans were forcibly removed from their homes and transported across the ocean. The numbers alone are difficult to comprehend. Ship after ship crossed the Atlantic, year after year, generation after generation. Entire communities were disrupted. Families were separated, children were taken from parents. Parents were separated from children, and for those who survived the journey, the loss did not end when they arrived. In many cases, their names were changed. Their languages were discouraged or forbidden. Their identities were reduced to categories that erased the details of who they had been before. The system did not care about preserving ancestry. It cared about ownership. And ownership required records very different from the records families would have wanted preserved. That distinction matters. Because when historians examine surviving documents from the period, they often discover an uncomfortable reality. The people whose descendants most want answers today were frequently the people least likely to have their histories properly recorded. The result is what genealogists sometimes call a historical wall. A point where the trail simply disappears. For countless families, that wall appears somewhere in the 19th century, sometimes earlier, sometimes later. But eventually the paper trail ends. And for decades, many researchers assumed there was little that could be done. Then genetics entered the conversation. At first, the idea sounded almost impossible. How could DNA reveal history? How could a biological code passed from parent to child contain clues about events that happened centuries ago? The answer begins with a simple fact. DNA is more than a set of biological instructions. It is also a record of ancestry. Every generation inherits genetic material from those who came before. And while names can be lost, documents destroyed, and memories forgotten, genetic inheritance continues moving forward through time. Researchers began realizing that if enough genetic information could be collected and compared, it might become possible to identify patterns invisible to traditional records. Patterns of migration, patterns of ancestry, patterns of survival. But there was a problem, a very big problem. Even if scientists could identify those patterns, how could they know they were interpreting them correctly? How could they separate evidence from assumption? How could they distinguish history from coincidence? Those questions would lead researchers into one of the most ambitious historical investigations of the modern era. And what they discovered would challenge assumptions that had existed for generations. Some of the findings confirmed what historians already suspected. Others revealed details that had remained hidden for centuries. And one discovery, in particular, would force researchers to rethink how much history can survive even when nearly every written record has disappeared. But before we get there, We need to understand how scientists learned to read history from DNA in the first place. Because the method itself is almost as remarkable as the discoveries that followed. If you're fascinated by the intersection of history, science, and forgotten stories, subscribe now. Every week we explore evidence that helps us understand the past in ways previous generations never could. The investigation was about to begin. And the first question researchers asked was deceptively simple. If history disappeared from paper, could it still be hiding somewhere else? The question facing researchers was both simple and incredibly difficult. Could DNA preserve information that history had lost? For decades, that question remained mostly theoretical. Scientists knew that DNA carried ancestral information. They knew genetic markers could reveal connections between populations. They knew migrations often left biological traces that survived for centuries. What they did not know was whether those traces could be used to reconstruct one of the most disruptive events in human history. The transatlantic slave trade. To answer that question, researchers needed something that had never existed before. Data, lots of it, not hundreds of samples, not thousands, tens of thousands. And eventually, thanks to advances in genetic research, they finally had access to it. Researchers began collecting genetic information from consenting participants across multiple regions of the world. At the same time, historians were digitizing shipping records, trade documents, plantation records, census data, and historical archives. For the first time, two completely different kinds of evidence could be compared side by side. History. In biology, what happened next surprised even some of the scientists involved. At first, researchers expected DNA to confirm a few broad historical patterns, nothing more. Maybe they would identify general regional connections. Maybe they would verify a few historical assumptions. But as the databases grew larger, something unexpected happened. The genetic evidence became increasingly detailed, the patterns became clearer, the past began revealing itself, and suddenly researchers were looking at evidence that seemed almost impossible. Entire migration routes were becoming visible inside the genome, not perfectly, not completely, but clearly enough to ask new questions. Questions historians had never been able to answer before. One research team decided to investigate something remarkably specific. Could they compare modern DNA with historical records from the slave trade and see whether the two stories matched? If the records were accurate, the genetic evidence should point in roughly the same direction. If they didn't match, something important might be missing. The results were extraordinary. In many cases, the DNA aligned closely with the historical record. Connections appeared between Black American populations and regions of West and West Central Africa. Certain ancestral signatures appeared repeatedly, again and again and again. At first, this looked like confirmation. Historians and geneticists seemed to be seeing the same story. But then the first major mystery appeared. And it wasn't a small one. One ancestral signal showed up far more often than expected. Researchers kept checking the numbers. The pattern remained. Historical shipping records suggested one thing. The DNA suggested something else. The two stories did not fully match. Whenever that happens in science, researchers pay attention. Because a contradiction usually means there is something important left to discover. The obvious explanation was that the records were incomplete, but historians already knew that. The real question was how incomplete, and where. To find out, researchers dug deeper. What they uncovered revealed a hidden layer of history that had existed almost entirely outside public awareness. Most people imagine the slave trade as a direct route. Africa, then America. A tragic but relatively straightforward movement of people. The reality was far more complicated. Many enslaved Africans were moved multiple times. Some arrived in the Caribbean first. Others were bought and sold repeatedly before reaching mainland North America. Entire networks existed that connected colonies, islands, plantations, and ports. Human beings were moved through those networks like commodities. The written records captured some of this movement. The DNA captured even more. Suddenly, researchers were seeing evidence of population movements that shipping manifests only partially documented. The genome was exposing parts of a system that historical paperwork had failed to fully preserve, and that was only the beginning. Because another mystery was waiting, one that researchers never expected, one that would become one of the most haunting discoveries in the entire investigation. A population appeared to be missing, not completely, but enough to raise alarm. Historical records showed that large numbers of people from a particular region had arrived in North America. The evidence was clear. The documents existed, the ships existed, the records existed. These people were unquestionably there, yet when scientists searched for their genetic signatures in later generations, something felt wrong. The signal was weaker than expected, much weaker. At first, researchers assumed they had made a mistake. Maybe the data was incomplete, maybe the comparison model needed adjustment, maybe there was a statistical problem. They checked again. The pattern remained. The records said one thing, the genome said another. Now the mystery became impossible to ignore. Where had those descendants gone? What happened to them? Why would a population appear clearly in historical documents yet leave behind fewer descendants than researchers expected? To answer that question, scientists had to leave genetics behind and return to history. And what they found was devastating. The answer wasn't hidden in the laboratory. It was hidden in the conditions people were forced to endure. Specific regions of the American South relied heavily on labor-intensive agricultural systems. The work was brutal. The environments were dangerous. Disease was widespread. Mortality rates were catastrophic. Entire communities suffered losses on a scale that is difficult to imagine today. When researchers combined the historical evidence with the genetic evidence, a heartbreaking possibility emerged. Some populations had not disappeared from the genetic record because they were absent. They disappeared because so many people died before they could leave descendants. Think about that for a moment. The absence of a signal became evidence itself. The missing DNA was telling a story, not about migration, not about movement, but about survival. And suddenly the investigation changed. Researchers were no longer simply identifying ancestry. They were uncovering the consequences of historical systems in ways that no document alone could reveal. The genome was not just preserving connections, it was preserving losses. And the deeper scientists looked, the more complicated the story became. Because there was another pattern hidden inside the data, one that researchers had anticipated, but perhaps not at this scale, one that would reveal how power, violence, and inequality left traces that still exist generations later. And when scientists finally measured it across large populations, the results were impossible to ignore. The evidence pointed toward one of the most uncomfortable realities in American history, a reality written not only in documents, not only in testimony, but in the biological inheritance carried by millions of people today. If you've made it this far, you're exactly the kind of person this channel was built for. Subscribe and join us as we continue uncovering stories hidden beneath the surface of history. Because the next discovery would show that DNA can preserve evidence of events long after every witness is gone. And what researchers found next may be the most revealing clue of all. The deeper researchers looked into the genetic evidence, the more they realized they were examining something far larger than ancestry. They were examining history itself, not the version preserved in textbooks, not the version recorded by governments, but the version carried forward through generations of ordinary people. And that realization led scientists toward one of the most significant discoveries in the entire investigation. For years, historians had documented patterns of exploitation, coercion, and violence throughout the era of slavery. The written evidence existed: court records, plantation records, personal accounts, newspaper advertisements, letters, diaries. Historians knew these events occurred. The question geneticists wanted to answer was different. Could those events still be visible centuries later? Could they leave measurable traces in the human genome? The answer was yes, and the pattern appeared with remarkable consistency. When researchers examined maternal ancestry and paternal ancestry separately, they discovered something striking. The maternal lineages remained overwhelmingly African. Generation after generation, mother after mother, the African genetic signal remained strong, but the paternal line told a different story. A significant portion carried European ancestry. The asymmetry was impossible to ignore. Researchers saw the same pattern repeatedly across large datasets. The evidence aligned with what historians had documented for generations. The genome was preserving a biological record of unequal power, a record that continued moving through generations long after the original events had passed. This was not a new historical discovery. Historians had long understood these realities. What was new was the scale. For the first time, researchers could measure patterns across entire populations, and the results reinforced a difficult truth. History leaves marks that survive longer than anyone expects, sometimes for centuries. Sometimes in ways no one originally imagined. Yet even this was not the discovery that surprised researchers most, because another question remained unanswered: if records were lost, if names disappeared, if entire family histories were erased, how much of the original story actually survived? The answer turned out to be far more hopeful than many expected. Despite centuries of disruption, despite forced migration, despite violence, despite the destruction of records, the foundation remained. The dominant genetic signal within Black American ancestry remained overwhelmingly connected to West and West Central Africa. The oldest threads endured. Generation after generation, century after century, the system changed countless lives, but it did not erase everything. In fact, some researchers began describing DNA as a kind of historical archive, not because it preserves every detail. It doesn't, but because it preserves connections. And sometimes those connections survive even when everything else is gone. That realization became even more powerful as genetic databases expanded. Researchers began making discoveries that would have sounded impossible only a few decades earlier. In some cases, descendants were being connected to communities their families had been separated from centuries ago. In others, genetic relationships were helping identify links that traditional records could never establish. And perhaps most remarkably, researchers started finding evidence that people long considered lost to history had never truly disappeared at all. Their names may have vanished, their documents may have vanished, but their descendants were still here, living, working, raising families, carrying forward pieces of a story they may never have known they inherited. Imagine being told that an ancestor whose life was barely recorded anywhere had left traces that survived for 200 years. Imagine learning that history had not forgotten them as completely as it seemed. That possibility has transformed the way many researchers think about historical recovery. Because for generations, the assumption was that once records disappeared, the story ended. Genetics revealed something different. Sometimes the story continues, not on paper, in people, but there is an important caution here, and it matters a lot. DNA is powerful, extraordinarily powerful, but it is not magic. It cannot tell us everything. It cannot recover every name. It cannot reconstruct every family tree. It cannot replace oral history. It cannot replace historical scholarship. It cannot replace archaeology. And it cannot answer every question. Anyone who claims otherwise is overselling what genetics can do. Researchers themselves are usually the first to acknowledge these limits. DNA reveals patterns, probabilities, connections, possibilities. It does not provide a perfect record of the past. History remains complicated, messy, incomplete, human. And perhaps that is exactly why the combination of genetics and history has become so valuable. Each fills gaps the other cannot. Documents provide context. Genetics provides patterns. Archaeology provides physical evidence. Oral traditions preserve memory. Together, they create a fuller picture than any one source could ever provide alone. The most important lesson from this entire investigation may not be scientific at all. It may be human, because beneath every statistic lies a person. Behind every dataset lies a family. Behind every genetic marker lies a life that once unfolded in the real world. A person who loved, worked, struggled, dreamed, and hoped for a future they would never see. When scientists compare DNA across centuries, they are not simply studying molecules. They are studying the consequences of human decisions, human systems, human resilience. And nowhere is that resilience more visible than in the survival of stories that were never supposed to survive. The systems that existed during slavery often treated people as property. Many records reduced human beings to numbers. Many lives were documented only when their labor held economic value. Yet despite all of that, something endured. Connections endured, families endured, communities endured, memory endured. And now, piece by piece, researchers are helping recover fragments of what was nearly lost. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to remind us that history is rarely as fragile as it appears. The past has a remarkable ability to survive, sometimes in books, sometimes in archives, sometimes in photographs, and sometimes in places no one expects. Inside the biological inheritance carried from one generation to the next. That is why this story matters, not because DNA solved every mystery. It didn't. Not because every question has been answered. It hasn't, but because it revealed something profound. The people who were meant to disappear never truly did. Their stories remained, their descendants remained, their influence remained. And even after centuries of loss, pieces of their history are still being discovered. The history that seemed gone was never completely gone. It was waiting, waiting inside the evidence, waiting inside families, waiting inside the genome itself. And perhaps that is the most remarkable finding of all. Not that science can recover every lost chapter, but that despite everything history attempted to erase, so much still survives. Every generation inherits pieces of a much larger story, and the more we learn about the past, the more we understand ourselves. If you enjoy evidence-based historical documentaries like this one, subscribe and join us as we continue uncovering the forgotten chapters of human history. Because some of history's most important stories are still waiting to be found.